The sheep station at Carver's Bluff sat 12 miles from the nearest town, and in the third week of October it was already cold enough that your breath came out ahead of you like a warning. The woman standing on the loading dock at Mill Haven's Mercantile that morning was not the kind of woman who invited pity, which made what was happening to her worse to watch. Her name was Nora Voss. She had arrived on the Tuesday stage with 2 bags and a cedarwood spool box tucked under one arm, the kind of box a person keeps because the things inside it belong to someone they loved. She had come about the spinning work. The advertisement had been specific. Experienced hand spinner, wool preparation, fair wages, room provided. She had written ahead. She had received a letter back. She had the letter with her, in fact, folded into the pocket of her coat, because she was the kind of woman who kept her evidence in order. The man behind the mercantile counter was named Aldous Cray. He was the sort of man whose pleasantness had a floor to it, and she had found the floor. He told her, in front of 4 other women who had come in for dry goods and would remember every word, that the position had been filled 2 weeks prior. He told her the letter she had received was a misunderstanding. He told her, with his hands flat on the counter, and his voice carrying the particular kindness of a man who knows he is being unkind, that perhaps she ought to have confirmed before making the journey. She stood through all of it with her chin level, in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. She asked once whether the wages she had been promised might at least cover the stage back to Harlan County. He said that was not his concern. The 4 women said nothing. The cold came in under the door. She picked up her spool box and her 2 bags, and she went outside and stood on the loading dock in the October wind, and looked at the street of Mill Haven, which was not a large street, and considered her position. She was 31 years old. She had $11.40. She knew how to spin, how to card, how to dye with what the land gave her, how to read a fleece the way some people read weather. She had learned these things at the Harlan County orphanage from a woman named Sister Det, who believed that a girl who could make thread could make most things. She had also been briefly married to a man named Voss, who was kind, and then sick, and then gone. And that was the whole of that. She was not given to self-pity, but she was also not foolish enough to pretend that standing on a dock in a town that did not know her in October with $11 was anything other than what it was. By the time the frost settled in for good, people in Mill Haven would stop calling what happened next a charity case. She didn't know that yet. The man who had watched the scene from across the street was named Callum Greer. He was 38, wide through the shoulders, with hands that showed every season he had worked through. He ran the Carver's Bluff sheep station, 12 miles out, which he had inherited from his father along with its debts, its reputation for difficult terrain, and its flock of Rambouillet cross that produced wool so dense and fine that it was, in most years, the best clip in the county. In a bad year, it was still better than most. This had not been a bad year for the wool. It had been a bad year for nearly everything else. His shearer had left in August. His cook and housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Ferris, had gone to live with her daughter in September. He had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Pete and Cale Drummond, who were loyal and competent and could not cook a thing that didn't require an apology. He had 2 children, a girl of 9 named Wren, who had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of watching before she spoke, and a boy of 5 named Eli, who had not yet learned to be careful with his feelings and said whatever was true the moment it was true. Their mother had died 3 winters ago. Callum had carried that for long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. The way you stop noticing the sound of wind when you live somewhere it never fully stops. He crossed the street. He was not a man who deliberated long once he had seen what a situation was. He stopped at the bottom of the dock steps. She looked down at him with the expression of a woman who had already absorbed one humiliation that morning and was prepared, if necessary, to absorb another. He said, "I heard what he told you." She said nothing. "I have a station out at Carver's Bluff," he said. "I've got 240 fleeces that need skirting and spinning before March, and nobody to do it. The work is real, and the wages are real. Room and board included. I can show you the written terms if that matters to you." She looked at him for a moment. The wind moved between them. "It matters," she said. "Then I'll write them before we leave," he said. "There's a table inside the post office." He did not say it would be all right. He did not say she could trust him. He said there was a table, and that he would write the terms, and that was the kind of thing she could measure. She picked up her bags. He reached up and took the heavier one without asking, not as a performance, just because it was heavy and he was standing there. They went into the post office and he wrote out the terms in plain language on a sheet of paper and signed it, and she read it twice and signed it beneath him. The postmaster witnessed it without comment. They were back outside in 8 minutes. He had a wagon. She set her spool box on the seat between them, and they drove out of Millhaven on the north road without speaking, which suited them both. The road to Carver's Bluff took an hour and a half in the wagon. The land opened up as they left town, the hills going pale gold and gray-brown with the season, the ridgeline to the north showing the first permanent white. She watched it without performing interest, just taking it in the way a practical person takes in a new place. Roads, grades, water sources, distances. He drove and said nothing. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, he told her the children's names, their ages, and the fact that Eli would probably tell her something personal within the first 10 minutes, and she should not be alarmed by it. She said she had grown up around children and was not easily alarmed. He nodded once and returned to driving. The station came into view as they crested the last ridge. A long, low house of squared timber, a barn painted the red of old iron, 2 outbuildings, a wool shed set apart from the rest with its doors facing south. The fencing ran in clean lines down the slope, and the flock was visible as a pale moving mass in the lower pasture, a few hundred animals drifting in the cold grass. She looked at the wool shed. It was well built. She looked at the house. There was smoke from the chimney, which meant the Drummond brothers had kept the fire. And there was a child standing on the porch, which was Eli, watching the wagon come up the track with the complete attention of a 5-year-old who has been waiting. He jumped off the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. He told her his name was Eli, and that he had lost a tooth, and that Pete had burned the porridge that morning and they'd had to eat bread. She told him her name was Nora, and that burnt porridge was a serious matter, and she didn't take it lightly. The corner of Callum's mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. Wren appeared in the doorway. She looked at Nora from the threshold with her father's measuring eyes and said nothing. Nora did not try to win her. She simply said, "Hello, Wren," and carried her own bag up the steps and went inside. The room they gave her was off the back of the house, small and clean, with a window that faced the wool shed. There was a hook on the wall and a quilt on the bed, and a wash stand with a plain white pitcher. She set her spool box on the windowsill. She unpacked her 2 bags with the efficiency of a person who has unpacked in unfamiliar rooms before and does not require them to feel like home before she can sleep in them. In the morning she went to the wool shed before breakfast. The fleeces were stored in the old way, rolled and tied, stacked on the slatted shelving that ran along both walls. She walked the length of the shed in the early light, pulling ties, opening fleeces, reading them the way Sister Det had taught her, checking the staple length, the crimp, the grease content, the way the fibers held together at the tip. What she found made her stand still for a moment in the cold of the shed. The wool was extraordinary, dense, fine, with a crimp so consistent it was almost like a signature. Someone had been managing this flock with real knowledge. She did not know yet that it had been Callum's wife, that she had kept the breeding records herself and known every animal by its clip, and that, after she died, Callum had kept the records going because stopping them would have been a kind of erasure he was not willing to make. She started skirting the first fleece. She worked through the morning without stopping. Pete Drummond brought her coffee at 9 o'clock, which she accepted without looking up. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. He had expected she would learn later, someone who would need to be shown things. He went back to the house and told his brother that the woman knew what she was doing, and Cale said he'd figured as much from the way she'd looked at the wool shed before she'd even looked at the house. By the end of the first week, she had skirted 40 fleeces, set up the great wheel that had been standing idle in the corner of the shed, and begun spinning. The yarn she produced was even and strong, the twist consistent, the draw controlled. She worked with a quietness that was not the quietness of someone who had nothing to say, but of someone who had decided that work was its own conversation. Eli visited the shed every afternoon and talked to her while she spun, which she permitted because she had learned that a child who is allowed to talk while you work will eventually tell you everything that matters. Wren came once, stood in the doorway for 3 minutes watching the wheel, and left without speaking. Nora said nothing about the visit. Callum came to the shed on the 8th day to check the first batch of finished yarn. He picked up a skein and worked it between his fingers, testing the twist, holding it up to the light from the south doors. He set it down. "This is good work," he said. "The wool helps," she said. He looked at the shelving, the ordered fleeces, the way she had sorted them by grade without being asked. "You sorted them. The fine crimp ones want different handling. Spinning them with the coarser lots would waste them." He nodded. He did not say he hadn't thought of that. He picked up his hat and went back to the house. She returned to the wheel. Nothing was said about the fact that she had reorganized his wool shed. She said nothing about it either. The second week brought the first real snow, a thin, early cover that melted by afternoon but announced what was coming. She began cooking in the evenings because Pete's attempts at supper had reached a point where even Eli, who would eat most things without complaint, had started looking at the table with caution. She did not announce this change. She simply started a pot one evening when she came in from the shed, and when the food was ready she put it on the table and sat down. Nobody said anything about it. The food was good. Eli ate 2 portions. Even Wren, who had been watching Nora with the careful neutrality of a child deciding something important, cleaned her plate. She made bread on Thursdays. She kept the larder in a different order than it had been kept before, an order that made sense to anyone who cooked regularly. She restocked what was running low by giving Callum a list on Sunday mornings, written out in a clear, plain hand. He brought everything on the list without substitution. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. There was a loose step on the back porch, the third one up, that caught a little under your foot in a way that would eventually be a problem. She had noticed it the first week. One morning in the third week, she came out to find it repaired, the board replaced, the nails countersunk. She tested it with her foot. Solid. She went on to the wool shed. Nothing was said about the step. She said nothing about it either. Eli had taken to sitting on the stool in the wool shed while she worked, not always talking, sometimes just present, watching the wheel turn with the deep contentment of a small child who has found a place that feels safe. One afternoon he fell asleep on the stool and she covered him with her work coat and kept spinning. When Callum came to find him an hour later and stood in the doorway looking at the boy asleep under the coat, something moved across his face that he set aside before she could see it clearly. He carried Eli back to the house without waking him. He came back to the shed doorway a moment later. "Thank you," he said. He was tired, she said. He went back to the house. She kept spinning. Outside the light was going fast, pulling the color out of the fields before you were ready for it to leave. It was a Thursday morning, 5 weeks in, when Wren came to the wool shed and stayed. She didn't announce it. She just came in and sat on the low bench near the wall and watched. After a while, she asked how the wheel worked, and Nora showed her, guiding her hands to the fiber and explaining the draw without making it a lesson. Wren's first attempt was uneven and broke twice, and she pressed her mouth flat with the frustration of a child who expects herself to be competent at new things immediately. Nora said, "Sister Det told me it takes 100 yards before your hands understand what they're doing." She was right. Wren looked at her. Who was Sister Det? Nora told her. The orphanage. The woman who had believed that a girl who could make thread could make most things. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you not have parents?" Nora said, "Not for long." Wren said, "Me either. Not anymore." Nora said, "I know." They went back to the wheel. After that, Wren came every Thursday. The wool was coming along. She had worked through 160 fleeces by the end of November, the finished skeins accumulating on the drying rack in even rows, sorted by weight and grade. Word had begun to reach Millhaven in the way that word travels in a small town, low and fast and ahead of itself. People knew there was a spinner out at Carver's Bluff. People knew the wool was being handled well. A man named Birch, who ran the dry goods in the next town over, came out one afternoon and looked at the finished yarn and asked about price. She let Callum handle the price. She went back to work. It was the last Saturday of November when Eli said the thing. They were at supper, all 5 of them. The lamp lit against the early dark, the stove going. Eli had been given a second piece of bread and was content with the world in the way of a child whose immediate needs are met. He looked across the table at Nora and then at his father and then back at Nora and said, with the complete seriousness of a 5-year-old, delivering a conclusion he has arrived at through careful thought, "You're like our mama now." The table went still. Callum set down his fork. Wren looked at her plate. Nora looked at Eli for a moment, with an expression that was not pity and not deflection, and not the bright false cheerfulness of an adult managing a child's mistake. She said, "I'm Nora, but I'm glad to be here with you." Eli nodded, satisfied, and returned to his bread. The table exhaled slowly, back into the sounds of supper. But Callum did not pick up his fork for a long moment. When he did, something had shifted in the room that nobody named, and nobody needed to. She went back to the shed after supper and stood at the wheel without spinning, her hands resting on the wood, looking at the south doors where the dark had come down full. She was not a woman who catalogued her own feelings with great precision. She knew what she felt the way you know the temperature of a room when you walk into it. Not measured, just known. She picked up the fiber and started spinning and kept at it until the lamp needed trimming. Callum sat by the fire after the children were in bed and looked at the middle distance for a while. Pete came in from the bunkhouse to get his gloves and looked at him and went back out without saying anything, which was one of Pete's better qualities. December came in hard. The ridge went white and stayed white. The cold settled into the land with the permanence of something that has decided to stay. She kept the house warm, kept the shed warm enough to work in, kept the wheel turning. He kept the flock fed, the fencing checked, the firewood stacked. The Drummond brothers kept the stock watered and the barn clean. The station ran with the quiet efficiency of a place where everyone knows their work and does it. She had begun leaving coffee on the back of the stove in the mornings, in the pot with the blue enamel chip on the handle, because Callum came in from the early feeding before she was up, and she had noticed he didn't always take the time to make it himself. He started leaving the lamp in the wool shed trimmed and filled before she got there in the mornings, because the walk from the house to the shed was dark in December, and she had been carrying a lantern. Neither of them mentioned these things. The coffee was there. The lamp was filled. That was all. It was a Tuesday in the second week of December when the wagon came up from Millhaven. She was in the wool shed and heard it from the creak of the gate, and she came to the doorway and looked. The wagon belonged to Aldous Cray. He had another man with him, a land agent named Forsyth, who had an office in the county seat and who carried papers the way some men carry weapons, with the particular comfort of someone who knows they are the most powerful thing in the room. They went into the house. She stood in the doorway of the wool shed and waited. What Cray wanted, she would learn in pieces over the next hour, was the north grazing parcel. Carver's Bluff ran on 3 parcels, and the north one was the richest, the one that kept the flock through the hard months. And there was a question about the deed that Forsyth had apparently been cultivating for some time. A question about a surveying error from 20 years ago that put the boundary line in a slightly different place than the fence ran. It was the kind of question that was not a real question, but was dressed as one. And it had the potential to cost Callum either money he didn't have or land he couldn't lose. She knew about deeds. She knew about this particular kind of maneuver because the orphanage had faced one once when she was 14, and she had watched Sister Det handle it. She had paid attention. She went to the house. She came in through the back and stood in the doorway of the main room where Callum was sitting across the table from Cray and Forsyth, with the look of a man who is managing his anger because he knows anger is not useful here. The papers were on the table. Forsyth was explaining the survey discrepancy with the smooth patience of a man who has explained it many times and knows that repetition wears people down. She said, "May I see the deed?" Forsyth looked at her. Cray looked at her. Callum looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, something between them. She sat down at the table and read the deed. She read the survey notation. She read Forsyth's papers. She took her time. Nobody spoke. She said, "The survey error is real, but the error runs the other direction. The boundary line as fenced is actually 18 feet short of where the original deed places it. The north parcel is larger than recorded, not smaller." Forsyth said, "That's not what the—" She turned the paper and put her finger on the notation. "The benchmark is the creek fork, not the ridge marker. The ridge marker moved in the flood of 1871. The creek fork didn't." She looked at Forsyth. "If you file this claim, the county survey will confirm that the Greer parcel extends north, not south. You'd be establishing that in the public record." The room was quiet. Cray looked at Forsyth. Forsyth looked at the paper. Something passed between them that was the wordless conversation of 2 men who have just understood that the thing they brought to the table is going to be used against them if they press it. Forsyth gathered his papers. He said there might be some additional review required. He said it in the voice of a man who has decided to stop. They left. The wagon went back down the track toward the road, and the cold closed in behind it. Callum sat at the table for a moment. She got up and put the kettle on. "Where did you learn that?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Sister Det had a land dispute when I was 14, she said. She made me read every document. She said a woman who can read a deed doesn't have to trust anyone to tell her what she owns." He was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," Nora said. The kettle came to a boil. She made the tea and set a cup in front of him, and one at her own place and sat back down. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and moved through the pines with a sound like something being settled. The story of what happened at Carver's Bluff that Tuesday reached Millhaven by Wednesday evening. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. By Thursday it had acquired the shape of a story people wanted to tell, and by Friday the shape had sharpened into something closer to the truth. Forsyth did not file the claim. Cray did not come back. The 4 women who had stood in the mercantile 6 weeks ago and said nothing while Nora stood at the counter with her letter began, quietly, to revise their accounting of that morning. Nora did not know most of this. She was in the wool shed, spinning. It was the following Saturday that Cray came back, and this time he came with his wife, and with a woman named Hetty Marsh, who had a voice built for distance and a concern for other people's situations that she had clearly prepared at home. They did not come to the station. They came to the general store in Millhaven, which Nora had ridden in with Callum to collect the weekly supplies. Hetty Marsh said, in the hearing of several people, that she supposed it was fine for a woman to live out at a man's station without a proper arrangement, if that was the kind of thing a woman was willing to do, and that she only hoped the children weren't confused by it, and that she said this purely out of concern. Callum had been loading the wagon. He came around the side of it and stood on the boardwalk, and the street went quiet in the way that streets go quiet when something is about to be decided. He said, "Mrs. Marsh." She turned, her concern already arranged on her face. He said, "Nora Voss came to Carver's Bluff to do skilled work, and she has done it better than anyone I've hired in 15 years. She saved this station, a land claim last week, that Forsyth and Cray had been building for 2 years. My children are not confused. They are fed and warm and learning things." He paused. "If you have a concern about the arrangement, I'll tell you what it is. I intend to ask her to make it permanent. That's the arrangement. Whether she agrees to it is her business and mine." He picked up the last supply box and put it in the wagon and looked at nobody in particular and said, "Ready when you are," to Nora, who was standing 2 feet away with a bolt of cotton under her arm and her face doing what she needed it to do. She put the cotton in the wagon and got up on the seat. They drove out of Millhaven without speaking. The road north was cold and bright, the sky a hard winter blue, the ridgeline white above them. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. She looked at the road. He drove. The horses moved at their steady pace, and the cold came down off the ridge, and the station appeared on the horizon, the barn red against the white hills, the smoke rising from the house in a thin, straight line. He did not bring it up again that day. He did not bring it up the next day either. She kept working. He kept working. The Drummond brothers kept their opinions to themselves, which was notable. Eli asked her on Monday if she was going to stay forever, and she told him she didn't know yet, which was the honest answer, and he accepted it with the equanimity of a child who has been told the truth enough times to recognize it. Wren came to the wool shed on Thursday as she always did, and they worked together for an hour, Wren spinning, improving week by week, her draw steadier, her hands learning what they were doing. When they stopped to rest, Wren said, without looking up from the fiber in her hands, "Papa doesn't say things he doesn't mean." Nora looked at her. "I know that," she said. Wren nodded and went back to the fiber. It was a Friday evening, the last one before Christmas. The house smelling of the bread she had made that morning, and the pine boughs Eli had dragged in from the tree line and arranged with great seriousness on the mantelpiece. The children were in bed. The Drummond brothers had gone to the bunkhouse. The fire had burned down to a steady red-orange glow, and the lamp on the table was low. She was at the table with the account ledger, working through the wool sales figures for the month, because Callum had asked her to check his arithmetic, and she had found that she was better at it than he was. And neither of them had made anything of that. He came in from checking the barn and stood at the door a moment, knocking the snow off his boots, and then came and sat across from her at the table. She kept working for a moment, and then looked up because the quality of his stillness was different from his ordinary stillness. He said, "I meant what I said in Millhaven." She set down the pencil. "I know you came here for work," he said, "and the work is real, and the wages are real, and none of what I'm saying changes that. You can finish the season and go, if that's what you want, and the terms stand either way." He looked at his hands on the table and then at her. "But I'm asking you to stay. Permanent. As my wife, if that's what you'd want. The children want it. I want it." He paused. "I've been trying to think of a better way to say it, and I don't have one. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. He said, "You don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer this week." She said, "Callum." He waited. She said, "Yes, that's what I want." He was still for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled and right. And she picked up the pencil and finished the column of figures. And he got up and put another log on the fire. And the house held its warmth around them like something that had been waiting to do exactly that. Eli found out the next morning and announced it to the Drummond brothers at breakfast, with the satisfaction of someone delivering news he had known was coming. Pete looked at Kyle. Cale looked at his porridge. Pete said, "Well, good." Wren was sitting at the end of the table, and she looked at Nora for a moment with her father's eyes. And then she looked back at her plate, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that comes just before one. And she did not try to hide it. Nearly a month later, on a Thursday morning in late January, Nora stood in the wool shed in the early light and ran her hands over the last of the fleeces waiting to be spun. 238 fleeces done. 2 remaining. The finished skeins filled the drying rack and the shelving along the east wall, sorted by grade, tagged with the weight and twist in her plain, clear hand. The great wheel stood in the corner where she had found it idle in October, its spokes worn smooth by 3 months of use. On the windowsill beside the south doors, where she had placed it the first day, sat the cedarwood spool box. She opened it. Inside were the things Sister Det had left her: a bone crochet hook, a small steel gauge for measuring staple length, a folded paper with a dye recipe in faded ink, and at the bottom, a short length of the first yarn Nora had ever spun, uneven and thick-thin, the work of hands that did not yet know what they were doing. She had kept it because Sister Det had told her to, had said that the first thing you make badly is the proof that you began, and you should never throw away the proof that you began. She held the short length of yarn for a moment and set it back and closed the box. Callum appeared in the doorway of the shed with 2 cups of coffee, the blue enamel chip pot in his other hand. He set 1 cup on the workbench beside her. He looked at the nearly finished racks of yarn. 2 left, she said. "I can see that," he said. "I'll finish them today." He looked at the spool box on the sill. He had never asked her about it. She had never explained it. Some things change the moment you look at them straight. And they had both understood without discussion that the box was hers in a way that required no accounting. He said, "Birch wants to talk about a standing order. Spring clip through winter. He said the yarn sold out in 4 days." She picked up her coffee. "Tell him the price goes up in the spring. The fine crimp lots are worth more than he's paying." "I'll tell him," he said. He stayed in the doorway for a moment, not because he had more to say, but because the morning was clear and cold, and the light was coming in strong through the south doors, and the wheel was there, and the finished wool was there, and she was there. And it was the kind of morning that asks nothing of you except that you be present in it. He went back to the house. She set down the coffee and sat at the wheel and picked up the last fiber and began to draw. Aldous Cray's mercantile had a quieter winter than usual. He did not come back to the station. Forsyth did not refile. Hetty Marsh, when she saw Nora in Millhaven in February, found that she had something to attend to it on the other side of the street. This was as close to an apology as such people give, and Nora did not require more than that. The wedding was in February, at the station, with the Drummond brothers as witnesses, and Eli in his good shirt, and Wren with her hair braided the way Nora had shown her, a thing she had asked to learn one Thursday morning without saying why. The circuit preacher came out from Millhaven and said the words, and Callum said the words, and Nora said the words, and it was done. Pete made a cake that was better than anyone expected, and he accepted the compliments on it with the gravity of a man who has finally found a thing he is good at. That evening, after the children were in bed, Nora went to the wool shed one last time and stood in it in the dark, not for any practical reason, just to stand in the place where the winter had happened. The great wheel was still. The empty shelving waited for the spring clip. The cedarwood spool box sat on the window sill, where she had put it in October. The same box, the same sill, but the window now looked out on a place that was hers. She went back to the house. By the time the first thaw came in the March and the ewes started dropping their lambs in the lower pasture, the station at Carver's Bluff had a different quality to it, harder to name than to feel. The fencing was tight. The barn was sound. The ledger balanced. The bread was made on Thursdays. Wren's spinning had reached the point where her yarn was even enough to sell, which she announced to her father with a composure that did not entirely conceal how much it meant to her. Eli had lost 2 more teeth and gained a vocabulary of wool terms that he deployed at breakfast with great authority. The Drummond brothers had stopped apologizing for the cooking because there was nothing left to apologize for. Callum came in from the afternoon, feeding one day in the late March, and found Nora at the table with the account ledger and a cup of tea, and the cedarwood spool box open beside her, the old uneven yarn in her hand. He sat down across from her. She held up the yarn. "Sister Det kept this," she said. "She said the first thing you make badly is the proof that you began." He looked at it. "What did you make it into?" "Nothing," she said. "It's just the proof." He nodded. She set it back in the box and closed it and pushed the ledger toward him so he could see the spring figures. And outside, the light was long and gold across the pasture, and the ewes moved through it with their new lambs, and the pines on the ridge held the last of the cold without complaint, the way they always did, the way everything at Carver's Bluff had learned to do, and then to let it go. The wool shed doors stood open to the March air. The great wheel waited. In the lower pasture, the new fleeces were already growing. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. And that was the story of Nora Voss, a spinner who arrived at Carver's Bluff with 2 bags and a cedarwood spool box, and found in the wool nobody wanted, and the man who kept it, everything that lasts. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.